Welcome everyone to the Maine Climate Table's Climate Conversation Series. My name is John Hagan. I'm chair of the Maine Climate Table, and our goal with this series is to give you information you can all use to form your own opinion about various important climate topics. We're going to skip August, but in September we'll be back having a conversation about the role of nuclear energy in helping to solve the climate challenge. So I hope you'll all come back for that. But today we're going to be exploring the topic of putting a price on carbon emissions using the fee and dividend approach. And yes, it's a kind of carbon tax, except that the government doesn't keep the revenue, it gives the money back. So we're going to talk about how this fee and dividend approach would work to curb greenhouse gas emissions. We'll dive a little deeper into some of the technical challenges. Well, how do you set a price? How do you set the price of the tax? And where in the supply chain might that tax be levied? We'll talk a little bit about the design of a fee and dividend program to be equitable so that it doesn't disproportionately affect those who can least afford it. We've got three perfect guests for this conversation today. David, Peter, and David, two Davids, one Peter, if you guys could turn on your cameras, I'll introduce you. Let me see if I can get gallery view going here. So David Vail, David is Adams Catlin Professor of Economics at Bowdoin. David has a lot of experience using economic levers to drive social change, such as ecotourism and green energy and sustainability standards, and the fee and dividend lever as well. So we need an economist. David's our economist. We got Peter Dugas. Peter is a certified En-ROADS Climate Change Solutions Simulator ambassador. That's a pretty official title. If anybody hasn't seen En-ROADS or played around with En-ROADS, I would recommend that you do that. EN-ROADS. I've got that right, I think, Peter. And as if you just Google it, it'll come right up. And it's a really fantastic tool for imagining a different climate future. And you can see the impacts of different decisions that you would make on the future climate. So it's a great tool, and Peter teaches folks how to use that. He's also a volunteer co-chair at the Portland, Maine chapter Citizens Climate Lobby, and is coordinator and liaison to Senator King's office. And finally, David Reed-Miller is director of the Climate Center at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. I think he came to Maine a little over a year ago. We're really glad he's here and not in Washington anymore. I hope he feels the same. David directed, those of you who keep up with climate science probably know that David directed the 4th National Climate Assessment that came out in 2018. Huge volume, 300 some volunteers, scientists help put that together. David, I don't know how you got that out in the Trump administration, but I don't know, maybe you can tell us how you pull that off. But he was also the State Department's Office of Global Change for 5 years under the Obama administration, and helped lead the U.S. science and technology negotiations for the Paris Agreement. So David R. knows a lot about the national, sort of the executive branch of government, and sort of how we interact internationally on climate change. So we've got, as you can see, we've got three wonderful people with us today to talk about this topic, which I'm anxious to learn more about. Just quickly, logistics, you all should have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you've got a question at any point during the session, click on that and type in your question, and we'll try to get to it at the end. I think if other people hit the like button, it'll kind of upvote that question, so it'll rise to the top. So if you see that somebody else has asked a question you like, just like it and it'll rise to the top. I think we'd like to, even though you'll be submitting questions, I hope as we go, we're probably going to hold those at till the end, last 15 or 20 minutes, because I want to make sure I get through this sort of the basic material that we'd like to cover today, but we do hope you'll submit questions. It's a great chance to ask these folks what's on your mind. So with that, I'm going to turn it to, I've asked David Vail, because he's used to giving lectures in class. I've asked him to, it's pretty tall order, to in about 10 minutes or so, just help us in a 101 session understand the notion of a carbon tax and fee and dividend. So David, I'm going to start with you and give you the helm. Peter, you're going to handle David's slides. Thank you for that. And David, if you want to say something before your slides start, please do. And the rest of us are going to turn off our video so we can pay attention to you. David, the floor is yours.
Well, I do want to say something first, John, and that is to thank you and the Climate Table for the opportunity to discuss what I would call the policy toolkit that's available for dealing with a rapidly intensifying climate crisis worldwide. I also would say, you're right, I'm used to lecturing in 50, 55, or 80-minute segments. So we'll see what we can get done in
thank you.
The 10 minutes you've given me. My main goal is the title of my presentation. Peter, if you could bring up the first slide, is to explain why putting an appropriate price on carbon should be a core tool in that toolkit. So what John asked me to do is to talk about the basics of how economists view something like called external costs or negative externalities that arise in our miraculous market system as market failures. And I did want to mention that, of course, there are situations where there are also external benefits. That is, not just the people who buy and sell a good or service, but others may benefit from its provision. So that if you and lots of others living in an urban area choose to take public transportation, then I, as a car commuter, benefit from reduced congestion, reduced hassle for parking, less wasted fuel, and we all benefit from lower pollution. So there is a policy principle for dealing with beneficial externalities, market failures, and that is to subsidize the users, the people who take the public transportation system in this case. But what we're interested in today is talking about external costs of an overwhelming magnitude, and that is the costs of environmental pollution that fall outside the prices paid in market transactions. So one example that's pretty obvious is motor vehicle emissions, which have impacts on people's health, have impacts on corrosion of materials and on plant life. And there's a policy principle there too. We call it the polluter pays principle. It seems that it should be pretty intuitive. Lots of ways to implement that. We could tax the fuel people use to create a disincentive. We could tax gas guzzling vehicles to create a disincentive to buy those vehicles. We could tax highway users as an indirect way to make them pay. Peter, if you move to the next slide, please. So that in a way is the basics. But taxing pollutants, that is putting a price on them, or as we will be talking about, charging a fee for them, are important from an economic perspective because they create what we could call efficient incentives, that both buyers and sellers in markets that are affected by a pollution tax face incentives to change their behavior in a way that's beneficial to society. So clearly, a tax will raise costs and raise prices, and that is an incentive. We were talking about car transportation before, to conserve fuel, let's say, by taking fewer trips or combining activities in one trip, to substitute, like taking the bus instead of, or walking instead of driving a car for some activities. Those are short-run responses to the higher price that goes along with a tax. But what's really powerful is the dynamic effects over the long run when producers have an incentive to develop new technologies. That's what we're seeing with electronic vehicles right now, to take that example. And I thought I'd mention, because this is Maine, that we're seeing some really important action in the construction industry to move away from highly polluting activity materials like cement and steel, and toward mass timber construction, because it's a much less carbon emitting way of producing building materials. And we're learning a lot about how effective that can be even in larger scale buildings. I did want to say a couple words about why we don't use this particular incentive very much in the United States. We have a preference for things like technology mandates, which require, let's say, power plants to put smokestack scrubbers to get on their effluent to get rid of sulfur dioxide emissions. We use fuel efficiency standards for automobiles. They come and they go, depending on who's in power. But what I would stress is that these kinds of command and control approaches almost always create some perverse incentives. Now, it may not be intuitive, but if you think about it for a minute, a fuel efficiency standard applied to new cars creates an incentive to keep your older car on the road longer rather than paying the higher price for the new vehicle. So we can achieve some benefit, but we're not going to do it in an efficient way. And economists care about efficiency because resources are scarce. So just saying a little more about why we don't use that particular approach, the tax or pricing approach, much in the United States. I might say people like me don't make the laws. Most lawmakers are lawyers. Lawyers seem to have a proclivity for using the kinds of tools of their profession to regulate businesses. When you tell every polluter in the power industry that they've got to put a smokestack scrubber on their plant, it gives you the appearance of being tough, whereas a tax seems to some like saying, well, it's okay to pollute, just pay a little price for it. What I don't mention on the slide, which is obviously important in this country, is taxes are anathema to many, many Americans. Anything that looks, smells, or tastes like a tax is bound to generate some resistance. Finally, don't need to go into it today, but there are lots of pollutants where we can't really measure effectively what's coming out of a smokestack. Let's say in agricultural runoff, it's not easy to measure. And if you can't measure it, you can't put a tax on it. Peter, let's flip to the next slide. A tax on a pollutant is not the only market-like policy option. And in fact, in the European Union, the state of California with its power industry, we use a different approach, which is called an emissions trading approach, often called cap and trade, which can achieve, under some circumstances, achieve the same kinds of results. So taxes are not the only policy, a market-like policy option. And in fact, there's a good case for using an emissions trading system in certain situations, because the government entity can set a cap on the amount of emissions and be fairly confident that when they give out allowances only up to that cap, they've got a lever for controlling. One of the limitations of putting a tax on a pollutant is you don't know exactly how people will respond. We can model that out. We can watch the evidence as it accumulates. We can adjust the tax as necessary, but we don't get a firm control over the amount of pollutant. The efficiency incentive with an emissions trading system is pretty much the same. It operates differently, but basically, if you want to pollute, you have to have a permit. If you're very efficient at reducing pollution, you can use your permits, your allowances, and put them into the market as a seller and get others who can't clean up their pollutants as efficiently to buy the pollutants. So there's a market price established between buyers and sellers of allowances, which economists believe should ultimately minimize the cost of achieving the cap that's been put in place. There are places where, and situations where this has worked pretty effectively. Back in 1991, the amendments to the Clean Air Act put a cap on sulfur dioxide emissions and then allowed the power plants, say along the Ohio River, to decide how they would go about minimizing the cost of achieving, limiting the pollution. And sure enough, some of them put smokestack scrubbers on. But the biggest change that occurred was they shifted from high sulfur coal to low sulfur coal. That turned out to be the cost minimizing solution, and the cap and trade approach worked to achieve that solution. But there's a pretty strong case against emission trading systems, and that is that they tend to be bureaucratically complex, administratively complex, and they usually create incentives for polluters to game the system. So if we're talking about a very specific pollutant, sulfur dioxide, coming from a fairly narrow range of polluters, namely coal-fired power plants, it's possible to imagine how this kind of approach would work. But if we're talking about an economy with upwards of 40 million producers of everything from refrigerators to restaurant meals to coal, finding a way to assign allowances to all of them and to design a trading system that would allow that many transactions would just gobble up huge amounts of resources and probably not be very effective. And as we're going to discuss more today, the typical design of a cap and trade approach doesn't generate government revenue. And we're going to make the case that for equity reasons, for fairness reasons, we want to have government revenue that can be returned to households as a dividend. Lots more on that coming in a few minutes. Peter, let's go to one more slide. There are lots of topics that I think we're going to want to get into today. An important feature of carbon pricing is that the more of the carbon we can catch at its source, the coal mine, the natural gas wellhead, the fracking source in the oil industry, and tax it there, the simpler the system can be. And what we expect is, because there will be higher costs to all the producers, initial producers of carbon, that those costs will get passed through and embedded in the prices of all kinds of other goods and services without the government having to administer at the detail level all of that stuff. A second point that I think we're going to get into in a lot of detail in a few minutes has to do with carbon pricing as part of the policy toolkit. It's pretty clear that that's not the only tool that's going to get us to our zero emissions in the power industry by 2035 or net zero in the whole economy by the 2050s. The climate crisis at this point is far too severe for any simple solution like a tax to be able to solve it. And going back to the externalities I was talking about before, of course, there's a wide range of public goods that the public ought to be paying for that will also contribute. So research and development, for example, Senator King is very strong on research into energy storage systems that can offset the intermittency of wind power and solar power. They're not 24-hour-a-day sources of energy. The transportation infrastructure that I hinted at before, like better public transportation options for people, or the electric vehicle charging stations that the president is so strong on. Those are public goods that also deserve to be part of the package. Much more will be said about that. So let me just mention finally 3 of the key features of most of the proposals, and there are many bills in Congress that Peter will be describing. One is that most of them want to limit the initial disruption in the economy by starting the price at a fairly low level, maybe as low as $10 or $15 a ton of carbon. That's 11 cents, let's say roughly 11 cents a gallon of gas. So you avoid a lot of disruption that way, but you have to raise that price fairly quickly to start having teeth and to achieve those goals for 2035, for example. The second component of most of the proposals that are being considered in Congress is some form of dividend payment to households. It might not use all of the revenue the government generates, but some of the revenue to indemnify households, especially ones lower and middle income households, for the higher costs they're going to bear. And finally, a really controversial issue in the headline news this week, because both the European Union and the Democrats in the US Congress are talking about using taxes on imports, that is tariffs, as a way of protecting our own industries that are having to face higher costs through a carbon tax. And as we get into it, we'll see that there's more than just that one piece of logic supporting some kind of tariff on imported dirty goods. One
Did we lose David?
Hey, Peter, I think we did.
Oh, that's too bad.
Can you,
No.
yeah, I didn't know whether it was just me or everybody.
I was worried it was myself too, so I'm glad to
Okay,
hear
thank you
your voice.
for jumping in.
Let me jump in because he's almost done with his slides, and
Yeah,
if he joins
please.
us, he can finish up.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Peter.
So I will let's see, adjust this. If David Vale, if you're back, just give us a shout so I know.
I think he just vanished completely. So
okay, all
I
right.
think it's yours,
Well,
Peter.
He had one last slide, but I'm Peter Dukas, and I'll take up from where he left off. And so as David was about to explain, there's a number of different carbon pricing mechanisms that have existed either ideologically or in actuality between a plain old carbon tax, a carbon cap and trade. Senator Collins 12 years ago co-wrote a bipartisan bill called the CLEAR Act, which was a carbon cap and dividend out of concern that a cap and trade policy would hurt poor and low and middle income Americans. And then carbon fee and dividend, which is what we're proposing and talking about here. And it's basically can be boiled down to 3 simple steps, as David was explaining. So a charge on gradually increasing charge on the fossil fuel at its as far upstream economically as possible. So the coal mine, the oil well, the port of entry, the fracking site. Step 2, return, and in the case of the bill we're most excited about, but ours we're hoping would be 100% net revenues to households as a monthly dividend check. That could be there's other simulations of that, as we'll see in a moment. And then the third is the border carbon adjustment fee, which David just trailed off on talking about, which was to protect American industry and to export the policy to charge the same price appropriately to imports coming in. So these are the number of bills that currently exist in the US House and Senate. And this is a very dense slide, but you can see, as John was saying at the top of the hour, we're talking about some of the design characteristics are what is the initial price and how quickly does it increase? What happens if we don't hit certain targets? What are our fallbacks to fix that? Where do we assess these fees? And what do we do with the revenues? From now on, I'll probably be concentrating on this, which has the most co-sponsors in the House, the Deutsche Bill, the American Innovation Carbon Dividend Act. Representative Pingree is an original co-sponsor, and folks from Citizens Climate Lobby are working to get carbon pricing at the table as we go forward with these current negotiations. And it seems like not only is this kind of a pivotal moment for climate negotiations, policy negotiations on a national level, but Maine is at a unique position. Maine has done great things, and John Hagan has informed all of us about that through his work with the state's efforts. The Governor Mills's laudable and ambitious policies of carbon neutrality are fantastic, and we should all be very proud of those efforts. But we need national policy to make sure that other states and the country as a whole will follow our shining example, especially when Maine has 0.32% of US carbon emissions. We need something to address the other 99.6%, 8%. And on top of that, Maine can do more than any other state because we are the only state with both of our senators on the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, which is 14 members, 7 Republicans, 6 Democrats, plus Angus King, who caucuses with the Democrats, who are looking at policies. And we know that they've been working with this and with and considering this. So I'll move forward and just talk about what those 4 bills look like versus business as usual, which is the gray line at top. We will expect some reductions in CO2 emissions this is percentage of 2005 levels. But you can see here that CO2 emissions go down quite a bit over the next 20 years, with perhaps, they're all in the same kind of cluster with the Fitzpatrick bill, kind of a little bit more modest gains on that. And we can separate those out. This is using the Energy Policy Simulator, another kind of simulator like En-ROADS, but can be regionally specific and nationally specific. So to change it up from the usual En-ROADS slideshow I like to do, we can separate this out as to how much of this is coming from other policies that are concurrent. So we're seeing business as usual on the top here for the next 20 years, thereabouts. You can see how much of this, our emissions reductions are from parts of the AIM Act, which became law at the end of 2020 as part of the big stimulus bill then. Methane capture and sequestration or destruction, and vehicle fuel economy standards, CAFE standards, that have been reintroduced in the early Biden administration that were previously existed and had been done away with in the previous administration. But you can see here how much of that additional carbon fee and dividend policy will be reducing from our emissions. Again, as David Vail says, this is not an either or kind of question. This is a and both. And since we are in such dire straits with the climate, considering that in the past 30 years, humanity has pushed more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than in all of human history till 1991, we're in dire straits. So we're pleased to see this, and we're hoping that this will become at least as the IPC says, a necessary component for any successful, effective, and equitable carbon pricing. Climate policy. Another model, resources for future carbon pricing calculator, will see where that Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, that gradually increasing price on carbon, returned to citizens, how that compares to business as usual, and where it says we need to be within that gray span of what the IPCC says we need to get down to reductions by mid-century to stay within their stated goals of 1.5 to, and if we blow by that, 2 degrees centigrade of global temperature increases. So there we will need, you can see also, well, yes, our Paris commitment is here, and the nice thing is that this is exceeding that. What to do with that money? So the first thing we've been talking about is the effectiveness of this policy. Second term is the equitability. As cap and trade, as we've learned about cap and trade or carbon tax policies that have been implemented other places, they can be tremendously regressive and you can see that there's 3 different ways of recycling this money or returning those carbon revenue back to the populace. So in terms of capital gains tax, we can see is slightly regressive, hurting the bottom percent. We're looking at 20 percentiles of income levels. So the bottom 20% is this lowest, the lightest blue, and the darkest blue is the top 20% in income levels. So that's from recycling, and that means labor recycling, which is just like income tax or payroll tax reimbursements, is pretty flat as well. But it turns out a lump sum rebate, which means an equal dividend check for every man, woman, and if you're a child under 18, you get a half credit, which is what the bill talks about, looks to be actually the most progressive because it actually benefits the bottom 20% greatly. This is percentage of their income levels. And everybody on average to about the 60 percentile do well. And the folks at the highest income levels, 60% and up, those are the folks who can most afford to decarbonize their lifestyles, and they're the ones who are paying most into that carbon fee as that money gets trickled, those fees get passed down to consumers from the point source. So it's not like your gas tax is going up itself, it's going up, it's applied upstream, but because most of the consumption is done at the top levels, those are the folks who will be contributing most. In other words, you and I'll be getting the same dividend check that Jeff Bezos does. But since Jeff Bezos is going to be spending a tremendous amount more because of his consumption, he's the kind of, with his private jets and his flights to low orbit and outdoor heated swimming pools and Sugarloaf or whatever, those are all going to have carbon fees associated with them. So he's paying a lot more in, even though we're getting the same dividend check. This is another map showing the same thing, breaking it down by 10 percentiles levels. I'll be very quick because I know time is of essence, but you can see here that the less economically advantaged interior parts of the state on average do better on households because those are the folks, and this is the part that's hard for people to wrap their heads around. It's because we think a lot of times about carbon pricing affecting what's called primary carbon sources. So that would be heating oil for your house, gas for your car, or the electric grid component for what you would plug into the wall socket. But turns out that most of the carbon pricing or carbon footprint is actually in embedded or secondary sources, which is, according to Noah Kaufman, between 60 to maybe even 70% of carbon emissions. So it's the carbon associated with things you don't even think about, like ordering goods or services to come to your house to do something, or uploading my phone's pictures to the cloud, or whatever that has some associated carbon price that you don't think about it because it's so embedded into the economic system. But because that is where most of where the pricing is going to be absorbed, the folks who have the least means of disposable income are the ones who actually make the best on the deal. And as I said before, the ones with disposable income can afford to decarbonize their lifestyle once it's been internalized. Where has this worked? Our favorite example is British Columbia, and now all of Canada. They had an experiment a dozen years ago amongst the Canadian provinces to see which Canadian province would do the best on, have an experiment to see which ones had the best ideas for decarbonizing or working to reduce their carbon emissions. And this is almost to a T what British Columbia did, with some small detail differences that we've learned from. It wasn't perfect, but since they've imposed their carbon fee and dividend model, they've actually, it's difficult to see data because it's still relatively new, but they have achieved a good reduction in consumption while their economy has outpaced the national average of Canada. It's been such a success that Prime Minister Trudeau has adopted it as the default or backstop policy for all of the provinces, unless they can prove that they adopt another policy that's equal. So Quebec was doing a cap and trade already, so that they are, if they stick with their cap and trade, no problem. But another province, New Brunswick, for instance, I don't know this, but like let's just say another province didn't have a policy, they would adopt this as their default, unless they came up with a better idea. And since then, it's resolved. But by returning that money, which benefits the bottom 60% as a net, all that 100% of that net revenue back to the consumers, is proven to be very politically popular. It survived, well, last polling, it's hard to poll depending on the Canadian province and depending on how you answer the question. It enjoys between 55 and 65% approval rating. And we think that actually will increase because they're tweaking it, because they had hidden those carbon dividends into their tax system. So a lot of people didn't know they were getting this tax dividend, or the carbon dividend. But if it turns out it's actually politically savvy to send people the proper carbon dividend check in the mail, so that they realize that they're actually getting money for this and it's not buried in their complicated tax forms. And actually, they've also borrowed the policy for the proposed American policy by advancing the money for the first dividend check to afford folks the upfront advantage of being able to afford that 11-cent price hike on a gallon of gas in the first year, but also to build the political capital for it. Because when you get a dividend check from the mail, as we know from the COVID check, stimulus checks, there's, people may not understand the policy, but it increases the popularity of it. This is a map of the country, all of the world, that either has a regional carbon pricing mechanism like we described in Canada, or considering one, or part of a regional one like the EU, which has cap and trade. So this is, this kind of addresses the idea of which parts of the world, the United States shares the distinction of not having a carbon price, a domestic carbon price, with the other gray countries here on the map. And you can kind of, look to see where we share that distinction with. 80% of our trading partners already have a carbon price. And you can see here that United States shares the distinction as being one of only 2 countries in the developed world, according to the World Trade Organization, without a carbon pricing mechanism. And Australia is way ahead of us on adopting theirs. It should be said that the carbon fee and dividend, as David Vail has said, has been in the press a lot recently, because the Biden administration has been talking about there's a number of things that they've been discussing, and Democrats in the Senate and the House, but they've been talking about adopting a border carbon adjustment fee without the domestic carbon price, which is very, very tricky if it was to be implemented. First of all, it takes some hubris on America to say that foreign imports will have to take care of their carbon footprint, but the United States doesn't have to, especially when you look at the list of all these countries that have something. And you can also, that's very unlikely to pass the World Trade Organization. And in fact, I would say that's probably well known by the folks who are throwing out this balloon, because they know this is a way for people to start the discussion about domestic carbon pricing and hopefully carbon dividends, which will help the poor, so that they can begin the conversations and we can adopt something similar to Canada, which has been so successful. I'll just move on and say very quickly that this is the policy that we're talking about also should be said to be very beneficial for a state like Maine, not only because it has such an effect on, such an important component. As I said, the IPCC says it's a necessary component for any successful climate mitigation strategy, but also because Maine has a relatively green electric grid, so we're ahead of the game on that. The state and NGOs like the Maine Climate Table have been doing great work to try to move the discussion forward so that Maine is a leader on this. And on top of that, a lot of kind of integral Maine businesses like forestry would do very, very well in a future where there's a carbon price. So if we have a gradually increasing carbon price, like any one of these bills is hoping to do, that would make Maine's cross-laminated timber and other construction products that come from Maine's forestry be at a competitive advantage over the carbon intensive industries like steel and concrete. So we would be at a competitive advantage there, and that's just one example. So I'll leave it there. I know that we'll want to leave time for David and also for the Q&A at the end, so I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Sure. And David, we got you back. I see you on the queue here. Peter did a great job of picking up the baton.
Yeah, my sincere apologies.
Glad to have you back, though. So I would like to turn to David Reedmiller a bit here. David, if you can turn your camera on. You know, I remember reading about first time I read about fee and dividend was in James Hansen's book, Storms of My Grandchildren, in 2009. I didn't know what it was until then. And I thought, well, if James Hansen's for it, I should pay attention to it. But here we are in 2021, and we still don't have carbon tax or fee and dividend. And as I'm reading what's coming out of the Biden administration, being very aggressive on climate, thankfully, but you know, Gina McCarthy and Brian Deese, the senior economic advisor, seem a little cool to this idea. And I wonder if you could help us. I know there's politics involved, always is, but there may be some policy strategy here too. I wonder if you could help us understand what that executive branch is thinking at this point, since you were part of them. Any thoughts can help us?
Sure, and I should, yeah. Well, thanks, and David and Peter did a phenomenal job, kind of laying the technical and academic groundwork. You know, and I should also just clarify that, you know, what I'm doing would be speculation. I don't have particular insight into you know, Administrator McCarthy's or Brian Deese's thinking here. But, you know, I suspect that a big part of this is that, you know, in an international space, the US certainly recognizes the leadership role it needs to play to drive climate action around the world, right? This was exceedingly important in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, which was why the US-China bilateral relationship was so important to both President Obama and to Secretary Kerry. And because once you have those two largest economies in the world, those two largest geopolitical powers in the world, agreeing to some sort of framework on something, it's very difficult for everyone else not to fall in line to some degree. That there were still a lot of things to iron out, but that is a piece of this. So I suspect that part of the play here is a carbon tax is going to be, or any sort of, you know, market-based solution is going to be exceedingly difficult to achieve the end result that this administration wants, which are remarkably ambitious climate targets, right? And, you know, obviously the untold part of that, of course, like you alluded to, John, is that the politics here, right? There are exceedingly powerful industrial business interests at play. And even if they are ostensibly supportive of a carbon price scheme of some way, shape, or manner, it's often suspected that the reason why they are supportive is either A, because they don't suspect it'll ever get into play, or B, it still allows them to continue the practice, right? And so it's you know, that market-based approach allows them to sort of continue the behavior that we want to stop, that we need to stop, frankly. And so this administration, you know, certainly has placed more of an emphasis on, you know, those other types of approaches that David laid out in the beginning, right? Those much more top-down approaches, those policy and regulatory approaches. You know, on the domestic side, I think you can make a similar argument, right? That, you know, the signal that the American government sends to American industry is exceedingly important as well. Just like we send a signal to the rest of the world, we send a signal to industry. And when you talk to businesses, right, what they want is consistent policy. They don't really, they care to a degree what the policy is, but they just want to operate in a predictable landscape, because when policy's bouncing all over the place, it's exceedingly difficult for businesses to make long-term investments and the things that they need to do to be successful. And so, you could argue, and maybe there's a degree of cynicism in this, that by taking a regulatory approach at the expense of, or in exclusion of, more of a pricing scheme, then there is a more predictable landscape, right? And you see this play out, for example, in the fuel economy standards debate, right? There's been a huge whipsaw over the past 5 years over what the big three automakers and things have done in this space, right? Because of the changing regulatory framework at the national level. And so when you have the extraordinarily ambitious targets that we now have as a country, there is more certainty of a particular outcome through you could argue through a top-down regulatory approach. Now, wholeheartedly agree with what David and Peter have said here, is that we've kind of gone past the point of having the luxury of an either or situation, and we kind of just need to throw all the spaghetti at the wall and hope a bunch of it sticks. So that would be kind of my assessment of the scene.
So there, one of the things that Brian D said in an interview with the New York Times a couple of months ago, David, was it resonated with me. It was something like, we need those charging stations like next year. We can't wait for the carbon tax to eventually trickle down and drive the private sector to deliver that. That's something the government needs to do, and it needs to do it fast. So it seems like the current administration, to your point, is working more, at least right now, on using the budget or the infrastructure package to get things done fast. And they're careful to say, not to the exclusion of a carbon tax, but can we just get this thing moving faster, sooner, because we need to. And I want to make sure none of us are painting a picture of either carbon tax or government regulation. It looks like it's going to take both. And one is maybe a faster, quick start, and the other one is this long, slow path that we have to use to get to where we need to be. And David Vail and Peter, turn your cameras back on, come back into the conversation. David Vail, I think one of you said that at the times maybe not right. You only get 3 reconciliation opportunities and then you're out of cards. And so they're not going to use one of those right now for a carbon tax, but maybe after the midterms. So Peter D and David V, anything to add about, not to bog down in the politics of it all, but anything to add about sort of the landscape we're in right now?
Sure. No, I think David Riedmiller makes some very good points. Some of the reasons why economists, more economists has signed a statement saying that this is the first most effective and equitable step towards dealing with climate change than any other economic statement. Almost like all living Fed chairs, 27 Nobel laureates, 3,600 economists. And the reasons why they all love it is the same reasons, perhaps, that some of our politicians don't like it, because it's setting a persistent and predictable increase in carbon price that doesn't allow for politicians to carve cutouts for their favorite things, or for them to protect particular industries that might be helpful for them in their home states. So once it's up and running, it's going. I think the other thing that's important is, you're right about the reconciliation. One of the other things to think about, it's not so much that you've got like 3 chances at reconciliation. It's basically, the way I understand the Senate parliamentarians' spring decision on this was that there's a relative, it's as long as it is very specifically about budget, that reconciliations are possible. And when we're talking about CAFE standards or top-down regulatory approach, not only is it vulnerable for a judicial review in a 6-3 conservative majority Supreme Court that we have now, but it's also but that that carbon pricing would not be as vulnerable because the Constitution is very clear about who controls the purse strings, and that's the legislative branch. So that's another reason. That's the same reason why reconciliation is a much more possible means of getting a carbon price as this important component. And it's not an either or. I think we're all in agreement about that. But it's important to remember that this is we need both. We need. I think you're both, you and David Riedmiller, are correct that we need some incentives right away and to get folks moving in the right direction. But we also need long-term stuff so that we don't have, when it's coming from the executive branch and we have, presidential orders, those political winds can change very, very quickly, and we're getting whiplash going back and forth between policies, as Dave Riedmiller rightly pointed out. But the real money for this, or the real decision making, is happening in the legislative branch, and that's why we have so much power than we think we do in the state of Maine, because of where King and Collins sit on this. And the fact that Collins has, has supported cap and dividend, which in some ways is a much more aggressive policy, or much more hands-on into the market policy, gives us great hope that we're moving in the right direction, and the fact that they will go in the same direction that Shelley Pingree did.
I wonder if any of you could comment on the fact that there is a Republican proposal from I think the late George Shultz and James Baker, which is also a fee and dividend. So it's the idea remarkably seems to have attracted support from both political parties. Maybe not right now is the time, but still, of all of the climate policies I've seen, this is the only one that I know of that's attracted interest, sincere interest and thought from both sides. I know there may be subtle different or maybe major differences between the Baker Shultz plan and some of these others on the table right now, but can anybody speak to the prospect of having bipartisan support for fee and dividend? And is that a hopeful sign?
I can speak a little bit to that. You're right. The Baker Shultz plan goes way back. And when you think about this, it kind of, if you think about it purely from a traditional conservative perspective, there's a lot of selling points, because it's not picking winners and losers. It's utilizing market efficiency to move everything in the right direction. It's basically internalizing that externality, right? The kind of crude, but well, I won't say my analogy, but what I'd say is that the Baker Shultz plan there are some big differences policy-wise, which is mostly because it's been 20 some odd years since Baker Shultz first started percolating. And so the climate crisis has just grown that much more. Baker Shultz talks about a $40 fee on carbon applied as upstream as possible, just like what we're talking about, but staying at that, adjusting for inflation, staying the same level, which is kind of the social costs of carbon. And while that's better than nothing, and we share a lot of the same design features, we feel like there's some problems with the social cost of carbon, because we know about feedback loops and methane being released in the Arctic and wildfires releasing. All these things it's hard to like put a price on this socially. And on top of that, we need to ratchet that gradually increasing carbon fee up, so that in year 3, this policy would be more than the Baker Shultz plan. It would persistently go up from there, returning all that money back to folks. Mm-hmm. So there are some policy differences, but if you were to plug in En-ROADS, like you were talking about at the beginning of the hour, the Baker Shultz plan, it does quite well especially compared to like regulatory approaches or maximizing the incentives of renewables or something globally. That brings us from 3.6 down to 3.4 last time I checked. Baker Shultz brings us from 3.6 down to 3.1 last time I checked. They're constantly updating that. And then the EICDA, the carbon fee and dividend bill that we're most excited about, that has the most co-sponsors of those four, goes from 3.6 down to 2.4. So none of them get us all the way there, but there are some differences. But you're right, the Republican support has been kind of quiet recently, but there is a strong movement. We know that Mitt Romney has said good things about this. We know that Lisa Murkowski has gone on the record as saying good things about this. Even Mike Braun of Indiana, Susan Collins is included on that list if you include her support for the Clean Act from 12 years ago. And we're hoping with enough pushing her in the right direction, she can come to the forefront. Because if we have robust political support, at least some from the Republican side, that makes it that much harder for it to be repealed when the political winds change.
Okay, I'm going to try to turn to some of the questions from the attendees here very quickly in the few minutes we've got left, and I'm not going to get to all of them. But let me just read one. What are anybody answer this that can jump in? What are the major policy challenges of integrating a carbon tax or fee system with the types of programs that are currently in congressional focus? Do they integrate well or not at all? So carbon tax, David R., you got anything to?
I mean, I guess that one of the things I would say is that, unlike, NOx and SOx trading, for example, where there were a few very dominant point sources that we could address the issue of greenhouse gases writ large. And remember, this is not just CO2 in our economy. It's the fluorinated gases, it's methane, it's nitrous oxide. The sources are really diffuse, and we've made extraordinary strides so far in decarbonizing our power generation sector, to the extent where now transportation emissions are the dominant source of emissions in the U.S., which makes us stand out in the entire world for being that way. But so I think there are real challenges, especially when you get to the non-energy sources. We have, even if our ability to quantify our emissions in the United States is probably better than anywhere else in the world, we still probably have an uncertainty of at least probably like 15% or so on that. And it's even more so when you get into the FALU sector, agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And so trying to accurately, price that sort of sector, although I think there is some carve out oftentimes for agriculture and even aquaculture and fisheries, frankly. I think there's real challenges in that. I think it will be easier in the transport and the kind of heavy industry sectors, again, because they're large power point sources.
John,
David.
Sorry, my video is not functioning, but
well, your voice is good enough. We'll take it.
Respond. I think it's a really interesting question about the degree to which a carbon tax would be complementary with other measures versus competitive with those. And one thing that didn't get mentioned in the discussion of Baker-Schultz, and also positions taken by the Chamber of Commerce and some others, is that what they would like to see is a rollback of many other regulations as a trade-off for the carbon tax. Auto efficiency, fuel efficiency standards are one example. My sense is that there's probably quite a bit of redundancy between a carbon tax and the grab bag of other things that the Biden administration is pushing, and that some of those, like major investments in rail transport, that is personal, what we call it, consumer rail transport, are probably not going to be a very cost-effective investment. And we can, as Peter was saying, and this goes back to the En-ROADS model, which you were touting at the beginning, we know that the most powerful tool if it's implemented correctly, is putting a price on carbon, and that probably quite a few of the other things that are being proposed would not need to be done. But the crisis is imminent. It's not as if we've got 30 years to sort of gear up for this. And so things like electric vehicle charging stations, that investment in R&D and carbon storage and such, those are going to be really crucial parts of the package, I think, as well.
Thank you, David. Let me come back to one question that Susanna asked here, and maybe this is for Peter. Canada has this carbon tax now, but there's a sense that the petroleum industry is still thriving in Canada. Can you sense the tax is having, or fee and dividend is having, any effect on the petroleum industry, or is it just coming from the bottom up, so to speak?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So Canada, because it only adopted as a national backstop policy the carbon fee and dividend 2 years ago, there's just no data for when that's all, it's only beginning. It's also, they had British Columbia, which has had it for the longest, since 2008, has only had that a static carbon price of, I believe, was it $50 Canadian, which is what, 35, something like that, depending on what the market's like, for all that time. So what's happened is a lot of these, and they have been hesitant to talk about, to roll it into the other sectors, into the other provinces, and to start increasing the price because of the hesitancy on the part of the United States to adopt this and their other trading partners. But now with the Biden administration, shortly after Biden won the election, and it became obvious that climate was going to be a central part of their platform, Canada has now agreed to start talking about having that Canadian carbon price start increasing. I think what happened is we saw the markets absorb the carbon price at the beginning and then started continuing to do business. And the Canadians had a system which is going away, which is allowing the first bit of like a certain threshold under which their carbon emissions would not be priced, so that they weren't just pushing their fossil fuels south of the border, their fossil fuel industry or the fossil fuel workers south of the border. But now, with looking like something coming out of Washington, D.C., they're going to be implementing it. But we do know, so British Columbia does have that status, though, that they have reduced their carbon emissions by about 12% over that first price, and that's without the gradually increase.
Okay, everybody, still have a lot of attendees on. We've gone over by 5 minutes. We're going to go a few more minutes. Go if you need to go. We won't be offended, but we're going to stay here a few more minutes and chat. And I wanted, Sam Saltonstall made the point that and I can't remember the news item, but it may be a couple of months ago, that there were some 400 major businesses in the US that were advocating for a carbon tax. They want the policy stability. They want it built into the system so that they can have some kind of sense of where the future is going. And does anybody have any experience with the business sector and what it's thinking about a carbon tax?
I can speak to that a bit. We know that Business Roundtable has endorsed, U.S. Chamber of Commerce has not quite endorsed, but made a statement of support. BlackRock, even, like some kind of, I wouldn't call them like a history of climate champions. And there is some because of that, there's a kind of an accusation that perhaps they are basically like greenwashing or doing this, as David Reed-Miller says. The suspicion is, why are they doing this? They're doing this because they know it's not going to pass. To which I would say, well, seeing how amazingly effective this is compared to other policy and how every other policy is doing this, let's call their bluff. We know that Republicans are going to be, and business folks are also freaked out about the fact that the EU has very strongly supported and has resolved to start imposing their carbon border adjustment fee starting January 1st, 2023, which will make the small Trump era carbon border adjustment, or not carbon, tariff wars look like a student film. And we know that they're doing that. The UK is joining them, and Canada is likely to do that right afterwards because they're all in the common market. So if you're a lobsterman from Maine and you're worried about, well, if you're already worried about lobsters moving the way that Maine shrimp did to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, they're extra worried about the fact that now exports for some, well, carbon intensive products will be chosen to be going from countries that already has a carbon fee. So I think that we know that those business communities know this is happening, and because this is persistent, and as David Riedmiller rightly said, this is something they can predict, and it's going to be something that they can make long-term plans with. Instead of, it's even if an onerous policy, as this gradually grows, it's much cheaper for them to do this and know that they can move in this direction than to have like an army of lawyers to define 50 different regulatory means for 50 different states, which is kind of what they have right now. Also, if you have the intellectual capital to build offshore oil derricks, you have the intellectual capital to build offshore wind turbines. But we have more and more businesses doing this, and we have over 100 businesses in the state of Maine, and I think 25 townships, including some towns that went heavily for Trump in the 2nd district, that have passed resolutions of support for this carbon fee and dividend.
Maybe David Vail, if I could ask you one more question, because Peter, as you know, the U.S. just said last week that it was going to have a tariff also on any embedded carbon products coming into the U.S. So it's everybody's tariffing everybody else, it looks like at this point. David Vail, how do you tariff other countries if you're not taxing yourself on your own carbon? Can you do that?
Well, I think the place to start is to ask, well, what's the institutional framework globally for enforcing anything of that kind? And at the moment, it's the World Trade Organization. And I think all of us on this panel have done some background reading to try to figure out what kinds of measures are likely to pass muster with the World Trade Organization and what kind are not. I think that the situation you just described, where, let's face it, it's Democratic politicians in the current reconciliation $3.5 trillion bill are talking about including tariffs as a revenue source. It seems quite unlikely that could pass muster with the World Trade Organization. It would seem so discriminatory if we're not imposing a price on our own businesses, but we're going to impose a price on those who want to export in the same sectors to the United States. So my sense is that particular approach, as Peter, I think, hinted earlier, is probably sending a signal about where we want policy to go in the future, which is to implement a price that would put us in a non-discriminatory kind of situation. But now, there's been quite a bit of talk in the last week about putting pressure on China by having this kind of measure included in the budget resolution. But the fact is that China is one of the countries that's now implementing a price on carbon using a cap and trade approach, a regional cap and trade approach, starting out at a price per ton of carbon that's only down around $8 to $10. So it's got a long, long way to go. But they're approaching it in a way that the World Trade Organization probably would ultimately accept. Whereas I'm afraid that the policies that we're putting in place, like a lot of subsidies and regulatory approaches, just don't fit with the World Trade Organization's statutory approach. So I think we're probably on pretty weak footing when it comes to telling the world we're going to retaliate against them.
Okay, well, I've probably gone long enough. We've gone over. I guess now might be a good time to contact your senators and legislators, because maybe next year we may see some legislative action. So maybe let your views be known to our own main delegation. And just thanks everybody thank you three, especially for sharing your knowledge with us today, being so generous. We don't have all the answers, but we've got some really good perspective today on fee and dividend. And we'll hope that we see some policy coming up soon and some action from the Biden administration through the upcoming budget. So thank you all. Thanks everybody for attending today. And if you want to talk about nuclear energy, pros and cons in September, come back to see us. We'll let you know. Okay, team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
Take
Thanks all.
care,
That was a lot of
everybody.
fun. Great
All right.
questions.
Thank you.
Bye all.